from Greenburgh, New York. We are here today honoring the African diaspora experience with living narratives. I am Tina Harper, representing the Department of Community Resources in Greenburgh, and our guest today is Dr. Charlotte Phoenix, author, mathematician, who's going to be talking to us a little bit about her family history and things that she experienced as an African-American growing up in Detroit. How are you, Charlotte?
Fine, thank you. Happy to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I had the distinct pleasure and didn't realize at the time how important it was a blessing to grow up in a 4-generational house with my great-grandmother, her daughter and husband, my grandparents, my parents, and then when they brought me home, I became generation number 4. And of course, as the different generations died off, it got to be down to 2 generations. And right now, I am the oldest living member of my birth family.
Incredible. So you said you grew up in Detroit, Michigan?
Yes.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up in Detroit in the era that you were living, and then talk a little bit about some of the experiences that the generations that came before you shared with you as you were growing up about the Jim Crow era.
Okay, actually, I was born in 1947. So by the time 1950 came around, I was just 3. I was still living in actually almost like a paradise. I was the only child in a house with 5 adults who pretty much made me the center of attention and never told me that children should be seen and not heard. So I was always allowed to ask questions. Everybody always took time to read to me. And my great-grandmother, who was blind, couldn't read books. So what she did was tell me stories. And the stories that she told me were the stories of her family. And so that is where my love of knowing my family history began, because before she died when I was 5, she had entrusted me with so many stories. And every time she told me a story, she would say, remember that. Always remember these stories so that when you grow up, you will know that you came from good people and good stock. And you are smart, you are beautiful, and you have a beautiful and rich history. So never let anybody take that from you, and always know that you can rely on your family and your ancestors to rise to whatever heights you want to go. So that was her legacy and her gift. And from it, I learned all about my grandmother and that part of the family. And then others started doing the same thing. And so I was able to hear a number of stories from my grandmother that told the story of her from the time she met my grandfather and so on. So I actually was able to look back and trace my family history back to the last days of slavery.
That's incredible. And the oral tradition in your family is one that I hope inspires generations today, those of us living today, to do the same thing so that we don't lose that history. It's very important. What's one of the most powerful or impactful stories that you remember your grandmother sharing with you?
What I remember from her point of view was the migration, that the Ku Klux Klan was threatening not only the life of my grandfather, which is really primarily who I'd like to talk about today, but they began to then threaten his wife once they learned that she was pregnant. So they began to threaten her and the unborn child. And that was when he finally said, I'm willing to put my life on the line, but I'm not willing to risk the life of my wife or my baby. And so they finally migrated from Mississippi in 1915. There was a family history of my grandfather's family in that area. They were right around Newton, Mississippi. And prior to that point, when they moved to Newton, my grandfather's family had owned property, which they bought literally right after slavery. His father had been a slave and was known as Thomas when he lived on the plantation with his master. And in order for Thomas to be of the best use to his master, master had to teach him to read and write and do figures, as they call math. But it was against the law to do that with a slave. Slaves were not allowed to read and write, and anyone who taught them to read or write literally could be killed for doing so. So master freed him. And to ensure that he didn't run away or leave after he was freed, he did not free his wife and child. Instead, what he said was, "You are free, and I will pay you to work with me in this business. And you can then make enough money and you can buy your wife's freedom and your son's freedom." So that's what my great-grandfather did. Within a few years after that, the Civil War was over, slaves had been emancipated, and there had been tremendous losses in that family. The original master and both of his sons were killed during the Civil War, leaving only his wife with this plantation she didn't want, and she was willing to sell it. Well, my great-grandfather, Thomas, had been saving all this money. And since he didn't need it to free his wife and son, he actually had enough to buy it from her at the price she was willing to accept. And so shortly after the war ended, he found himself the owner of about 400 acres of what used to be the plantation where he was a slave, but now he was the master. And when they called all of them in, one by one, they would bring the slaves in and they would say, "Your name is Thomas," and then whatever the last name of the master was. And he said, "Now that you're free, you can choose your own name." And he said, "Would you be interested in that, or do you just want to go on as Thomas, whatever?" And he said, "No, I would like to change my name." And so he changed his name, and going the way the legend has it, and I'm not sure how much of this is true, but supposedly what he did was he changed his name to Mr. He did know that white men called each other Mr. And so he changed his name to Mr. because he said he got tired of white men calling him boy. He said, "I'm a grown man, so I want to be known as Mr." And when they asked him what did he want for a last name, he said, "Oh, man." So he would be Mr. Man. Mm-hmm. And that was the way things went. And somehow along the way, he then also adopted the name Berry. So he was Mr. Man Berry. And that is how my family came to be the family of Berries from Mississippi.
So tell us a little bit about how the Berry family made their way to Detroit, Michigan.
Okay. Well, my grandfather, Claudius Newton Berry, some say that wasn't really his name because in those days people were prone to name their children sometimes by initials. In fact, my great-grandfather did have some sons that were named J.R. The oldest was J.R. because they wanted them, again, in the white tradition, firstborn sons were often named Junior. Mm-hmm. And so he had seen it written out. I mean, he wasn't a great reader, but he remembered seeing J.R. and it meant junior. So he named his oldest son JR. But as they grew up and after he had died, most of them took on actual names. So JR became my grandfather's oldest brother, John, and I think his middle name was Robert, but they would then fill in blanks. My grandfather was always a very precocious little boy, and he used to go to the colored school along with his older brothers. So he was actually reading by the time he was 3 or 4. And by the time he was 10 years old, he was ready to go to the equivalent of senior high school. And so by the time he got to be around 13, they actually sent him away to a school that was not a colored school, but a school that was available for money that would give them a better education. And it was from there that he ultimately went to Atlanta University, where he was fortunate to study under a professor there at the time who was W.E.B. Du Bois. And it was there that he became interested. Well, he was always interested in education, but he became interested in higher education, being part of that talented 10th. From there, he wound up, he was a professor for a while at Russ College, which is where he met my grandmother. And they married literally 6 weeks before she was due to graduate. He got an offer to come back to Newton, where he would be the principal of the Newton Academy for Boys. Mm-hmm. And when he went back to do it, there was an offer on the table. If he came back as a single man, they would pay for him to rent a room in a house, in a boarding house there. But if he came back and he was a married man, so he was now had a family, they would actually give him rent-free a house, a small house to live in. And this was a very big thing in 1950, not even just that he had a house to live in, when, as my grandmother, one of her favorite expressions when she wanted to tell you how unique and wonderful something was, she would say, few white folks and no Negroes lived in houses with indoor plumbing and electricity. So this was just too good an offer to pass up. And so my grandmother, 6 weeks before she was due to graduate, left college with my grandfather to move to Newton. And thereby he came with a wife and got to live in that house. Wow. That was how they got to Newton. While in Newton, like I said, he was educated by W.E.B. Du Bois and others who were very proud African Americans and who spoke about obtaining and protecting the actual rights that they were given when they were freed as slaves, but had not really been enacted, certainly not in the South. And so he started doing things that made the white folks uncomfortable, uneasy, and ultimately just plain mad. For one thing, he canceled contracts that had been standing for a long time for the high school with anyone who was not treating his students and their parents the way he thought they should be treated. This most specific case, and what ultimately led to him leaving there, was that he withdrew the contract from the local ice cream parlor because they did not serve Negroes inside. White folks could go in, sit at the tables, order their ice cream, and eat comfortably inside, where there were fans and other things to keep them cool in the hot Mississippi sun and even at night. Whereas if you were Black, you could go to the door, not actually enter the restaurant, but you could go to the door, not the front door, but you could go to the back door where people who had this were keeping them tied up. where the garbage was taken out to be discarded or burned later. And so he said, no, this is not acceptable. If you're willing to pay the same price for your ice cream as the white people are paying for theirs, you should be sitting inside with the cool fan to keep it from melting so quickly. And that's the way it should be. And of course, they were not willing to do this. And so he said, then fine. Then if the ice cream is too good for my students to eat inside the restaurant, then it's too good for them to eat here at the school. So he canceled the contract and went all the way, like 40 some miles away. He found an ice cream vendor who said, well, if they come here, they can eat inside. He then set up a contract with him. And once a week, that guy would come in a big wagon with huge chunks of ice. They didn't have the refrigeration like they do now, but he had these gigantic things of ice, blocks of ice, and with the ice cream in the middle. And he would bring the ice these 40 miles. And as soon as he arrived, all the kids would be on a half-hour dismissal so they could come out and get the ice cream before it melted and then go back to class. And he found that preferable to dealing with the local ice cream parlor was discriminating. And he did a few other acts of this. I used to laugh and say he was the nonviolent protester that was very similar to what Martin Luther King was for us in the 50s. But this was in the 1913, 14, that era. And they were just flabbergasted. They didn't know what he was doing. They just all thought he must be touched in the head. And so the Ku Klux Klan visited him and basically said to him, you know, your ideas are very forward thinking. You got all that education and you know, you're too smart for Mississippi. You really should consider leaving because all you're doing is corrupting the good Negroes down here with your foolishness and your progressive ideas. And you need to take those up to the progressive North, where ideas like that might be heard and followed. So he ignored it. They did everything. They did everything except burn down the house. They would come, they would throw buckets of blood all over the front porch. And my grandmother would be out there the next day trying to scrub it up. They wouldn't do any, interestingly enough, they wouldn't do anything to destroy the house. Because like I said, my grandparents didn't own it. They were living there, but the house was actually owned by someone white. So they would burn things on the lawn in front of the house. They would set a lot of things on fire, crosses and whatever, outside the house, but they never set any fires inside the house. My grandfather would go, but they had guns. They were really violent and they would be shooting up the guns, making all kinds of noise, especially on Friday night or Saturday night when they were drunk and really feeling very strong and powerful. And it became really scary for my grandmother. And my grandfather kept saying, don't worry, they're not going to do anything to destroy this house. And as long as we stay inside, they're not going to break down any doors or break windows to come in here and get us because they don't want to mess with whoever it was that owned it, his property. So that went on for a while. But then one day they came to visit him at the school during the teaching day. And when they came into the office, they said to him, you know, we've really tried hard and you just don't seem to get it. But we really think you should consider moving north. And as they were leaving, one of them turned around and said, oh, by the way, I hear we ought to be congratulating you. I hear your wife is toting a baby inside her. Yeah, man. I really hope we could come to an agreement because it sure would be a terrible, awful thing if something bad was to happen to your wife and that little young'un she's carrying inside her. And that was the final straw that made my grandfather said he needed to move. And it was a real threat because at that time, what they don't talk about a lot in the history books is they were lynching women. We know that they were lynching Black men, but they were lynching Black women. And on record, there are records of Black women, particularly pregnant Black women, who were lynched in Mississippi around that time. And they did horrible, unspeakable things to them. They would not only hang them, but they would burn the bodies. And in the case of pregnant women, they'd been known to actually take knives and cut the babies out of the belly of the dying woman. And when the babies fell to the ground, just jump and stomp on them and do horrible things till the babies were like just a big pulp of bloody mess. And this was not a fate that anybody wanted to happen to anybody. And certainly my grandfather didn't want it to happen to his wife. And so they snuck off. They made it known that they were leaving, but they actually snuck off in the middle of the night about 3 days before they said they were leaving, just in case the Klan decided to try to bother them on the road and string them up anyway, even though they were leaving. And so they wanted to come to Detroit. And again, this is a matter of historical fact. Henry Ford, who was, one of the pioneers in the automobile industry, was looking for workers to fill his automobile factories. And he took out national ads, in full-page ads in all of the main papers across America. And the ad simply said, "Come to Detroit, work for Ford's Motor Company, where we pay equal salary to Black, white, and any man, regardless of race, color, or creed. We pay $5 a day to work in the factory for Henry Ford." And so this is like right in the middle of what was already the Great Migration, which began, early in the teens. And it was part of that's where they decided they were going to go. They were going to Detroit. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, my grandfather was one of 18 children. His two older brothers by his mom were living in Detroit. They had already gone up to Detroit. And so he decided that's where they should go. But there were problems. Transportation was not what it is now. They were in a horse-drawn buggy and they were doing the best they could. Things were better in the North in the sense that you didn't have the daily violence and the lynchings. Not that they didn't happen, but they didn't happen nearly as often. But they worked. They got jobs in the factories, and Black and white worked side by side, but not for the same salary. So like I said, Henry Ford's offering $5 a day, which was a lot of money at that point in time. It was good money. Wouldn't make you rich, but it could definitely move you toward the middle class. In Ohio, they had the jobs in the rubber factory and also in the steel factories, and they were paying $3.50 a day to the white people on the assembly line, but $2.50 a day to the Black workers. Even though they worked side by side, the paychecks that they got, or the salary, or the cash money that they got at the end of the week, was definitely not comparable.
Which ironically is an issue that we still face today: equal pay for African American
and for non-whites. Absolutely. So, but it was right there. And this, again, like I said, this is all before it's actually before 1917. So this is also the time of World War I. So when they were there, and this was what was going on, my grandfather said one of the things that they had talked about when he was in college, and by the way, he not only had a college degree, he had a master's degree, which is how he came to be a professor in his 20s. He said one of the things they discussed was that if Black people want to be treated equally, then they have to show that they are good citizens and they have to act with the same love of country and patriotism as whites. And so he enlisted in World War I. The beautiful thing, well, not beautiful, but the interesting thing at that time, because Woodrow Wilson was a terrible racist as a president. He was not a champion for non-white people at all. But when he enlisted in the Army, there had been tremendous pressure from the fraternities and other civic groups, the NAACP and whatnot, had been pressuring Wilson since all the troops in the Army were segregated, as they had been since Blacks were first in the military, going back to the Civil War itself. And they were pressuring them that they needed to give Black people a chance to step up. And what grew out of these discussions and this pressure for Black soldiers who were already in segregated groups and who were treated badly, and they did all the worst jobs. People always talk about, oh, well, the Black folks, they were just cooking. No, they were doing the most dangerous jobs. When they would go, when they did serve and they would go to other outside overseas, they would be the ones that they would send in after there'd been a big battle and the little bombs had gone off. They would send the Black soldiers in there to pick up the bombs that didn't go off, the ones that they were to then gather them so they could get them back, reuse them, try to fix them, and then use them for future. But a lot of times when they would lift them up, they were live. They just hadn't exploded when they were supposed to. A lot of times they would explode when they moved them. So this was very dangerous. They didn't send the white soldiers out to do this. They didn't think anything about sending the Black soldiers out, because then, as people say now, Black lives did not matter. So they were doing the horrible work, but they were always in segregated troops that were led by white officers. So bowing to this pressure and as an act of goodwill, they set up an officer candidate school specifically for Black soldiers. And you can look this one up. It's there, you just got to use the internet. And it was in Des Moines, Iowa. And the Des Moines, Iowa Officers Training School for Black soldiers actually graduated a total of, well, first off, there were 1,250 Black soldiers who were sent to this officer candidate school. Now we're talking about 1916, 1917. These soldiers were all college graduates. 1,000 of them were all college graduates. Some of them had advanced degrees. They included doctors, lawyers, divinity school graduates, but everybody there. Some of them had been professors at HBCUs. Some of them had even been professors in Ivy League and other traditionally white institutions. But this was, in living color, the talented 10th that W.E.B. Du Bois used to talk about. And the other 250, 1,000 of them, as I said, were these college graduates. 250 of them were career military, because there was always this Black division that had grown out of the old Buffalo soldiers from the Civil War. And it was a rigorous 6-month program. But at the end of 6 months, out of the 1,250 that started, I think it was 630 or 633, around that number, a little more than half, actually graduated as officers. The vast majority of them graduated and were commissioned as second lieutenants. A few were commissioned as first lieutenants, and a handful were actually commissioned at the level of captain. And they were then sent to serve. We had an alliance with France at the time. And so some of them were sent to serve in the French army alongside French troops. The others were sent to serve alongside the American troops. And once they got overseas, that's where they were really treated differently. Despite the fact that they were officers, there was no respect for Black officers. If a white soldier who was a private, the lowest possible level, if he chose not to salute a Black officer, he would be reprimanded, but there would be nothing in his record and nothing of any significance would happen. They would just say, you can't do that. You're supposed to show him respect because of the rank. And they'd be like, yeah, okay, whatever. But if a Black soldier, even a Black officer who was a captain, failed to show the proper salute and respect to a white major, he could be court-martialed and hung. Mm-hmm. So it was not at all the same to be a white officer or a Black officer in this man's army. They definitely were not even as large in number as the white troops. They were getting some victories, but no one ever talked about them. If they went in and they were all killed or they didn't complete the mission as they thought it should have been completed, they would say, see, I told you, niggas are not fit to lead. That some of them aren't even fit to be soldiers, but they definitely are not fit to lead. So there was a lot of prejudice. The way my grandfather talked about it when he was explaining it to me was that in the South, prejudice was open. Hmm. You didn't have to wonder what white folks were thinking. They called you nigger to your face. They threatened you without impunity. They were just evil and horrible, and you knew what they were about. In the North, white people hid behind their polite courtesies, the fact that they spoke to you and gave you jobs, but it was a different kind of prejudice because, again, you weren't making the same salaries. People did not talk about you and call you out of your name, but they certainly had a lot to say about you behind your back, and it was still the same prejudice. Mm. He had thought that when he got into the military, this was the one place that they would get equal treatment because they were all soldiers. That was definitely not the case. So it was violent, like the prejudice of the South, and it was also more subdued in language, like the prejudice of the North, but it all added up to be one incredible, disgusting experience. The soldiers who fought alongside the French, it was night and day. The French had been told by General Pershing, keep your eye on these colored soldiers. They're like animals. Keep your women away from them. Don't let them have guns and other equipment unless you're watching them because they're violent, they're ignorant, and they're cowards. But despite the fact that this had been told to the French, they were still embraced and they were treated pretty much equally to the white soldiers. And at the end of the war, not a single Black soldier got any kind of recognition, honors, awards, nothing like that. Whereas those who served with the French came out with silver crosses, other kinds of medals, and some even the highest possible honor, which was the French Croix de Guerre, this Cross of War. And many of them came back as decorated soldiers. But that, again, was the difference. They were all overseas and that. So when they came back, there was a real anger and a fear. They were greeting the white soldiers. Oh, he's a veteran. Give him a job. Let's give him a leg up. Let's do this. When the Blacks came back, especially in the South, they met with violence, ugliness, the same stuff they had been facing before they went over and saw their friends die and get wounded in serving this country in war. And they would just do things like tell them, strip down naked, get that uniform off. You know, you were not a real soldier. I mean, it was disgusting. Many of them were lynched. They were beaten to death. And so it was the same stuff they had left behind, only now with even more anger, particularly from whites who had not served in the military. And there was even a song that was out there. And most people knew of the time, knew the song was very popular. And it went, how you gonna keep them down on the farm after they've seen Perry? And that really was the song about how were the soldiers who had served in Europe and seen that the prejudice they were facing in the United States was not a worldwide phenomenon. It was not that just white people all over the world saw them as inferior and disgusting, but that was unique to the United States. And so many of them joined in and became part of that Black migration and moved to the North.
How have your grandfather's experiences impacted your life decisions? How have they shaped your goals and the things that he shared with you and these experiences of discrimination and the history of what they faced as soldiers coming back from war where they fought for their country? How has that shaped you?
It shaped me in the sense that as a result of all of this, and as a result of the fact that even living in the North, he faced the kind of prejudice that he did. When he came back, he fought for equal pay for Black workers in Ohio. But again, history and the times shaped that experience because it was also the time when labor unions were on the rise. They were just being formed, they were moving on the rise. And my grandfather had negotiated with the owner of one of the factories to pay Black people the same that he was paying white people before one of the first strikes. So for the second time in about 3 years, he was run out of another town. He and my grandmother were run out of Ohio and finally made it to their primary destination, which was Detroit. I'm saying all this to say that in Detroit, at the time, nobody counted their degrees from the South. He had a master's degree, a bachelor's degree, but because they came from Southern universities, because there was prejudice in the North against the South in general, and Southern Black universities, it was discounted. They said, well, they're all equivalent to like a high school education. So he had been a professor, he'd been a principal of a school. When he applied to the Detroit Board of Education just to teach in an elementary or high school, he was denied. But at that time, and now when we move forward, even to the 40s after World War II, they were not hiring Black men to teach. Again, the old fear that you can't trust white women, let alone white girls, around Black men. No one ever said it outright, but that was the thinking that led to the fact you didn't have any Black men teaching. My grandfather found out that there was a law school, the Detroit College of Law, which these days is the Michigan State Law School. It's the law school of Michigan State University, but at that time it was called Detroit College of Law. They had accepted their first woman student, and they had accepted their first Black students. And this was, again, this is early on. And so what my grandfather did, he was working for Ford Motor Company, getting his $5 a day, but he was also going to law school at night. And so eventually the Depression hit. It's now the 30s. My mother at the time is 15. And though she should not have graduated until 2 years later, because she'd been double promoted and she too was a really excellent student, she was now the recipient of a Delta Sigma Theta sorority scholarship and a scholarship to Talladega College in Alabama. And this is 1934. Almost nobody was getting to go away to school because nobody had money. Black, white, everybody else was suffering in the Depression. So she had this opportunity to go to college and to have a real campus life. Meanwhile, my grandfather was going into his last semester of law school. And so his thinking was it was more important for her to get a college education so she never had to be a maid or any other kind of jobs that were predominant among Black women at the time. And so he sent her off to college and never finished the last semester of law school. Now you're asking me what impact this had on me. I grew up hearing the story over and over again. And going into, like I said, I was 3 in 1950, but I was a teenager by 1960. And I realized at that point, my grandfather had a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and 2.5 years of a 3-year degree in law. But in 1960, when he retired from his job as head custodian of an elementary school. And whenever I would get to college, and especially during the discussions and all of, the civil rights movement, and people have gotten, the right to vote has been reaffirmed, the civil rights bills have passed, and people would say to me, but certainly things have changed. Why is it you still feel that that life is not fair, or that Black people are put upon? I would say, my grandfather retired in 1960 as a custodian in an elementary school. He had a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and 2.5 years of law school. All I want you to do is show me one white person with the same credentials that is working a non-white collar job. And that always was my impetus to take education seriously, because my grandfather said, look, I never got my propers, but things are changing. And by the time you are grown, the opportunities will be there for Black women and Black people in general. You can be and do whatever you want to be. But as the doors of opportunity open, the only ones who will be able to walk through those doors are those who have the proper credentials and the proper education. So I don't care what field you choose, you will go to college. And when you get your bachelor's, you will go back for your master's. And when you finish your master's, you will get a PhD. I don't even care in what, but you will have your PhD. And when the doors of opportunity open, you will be right there at the front of the line, walking through to do things that have been denied from Black people all these years, but you will be able to do and be whoever and whatever you want to be. And that was the driving force for me to always take education seriously, to do my absolute best, and to pass that tradition on to my children, my grandchildren, the importance of education.
Charlotte, thank you so much. Your grandfather is a true inspiration, and so are you, for living his dream and living his dream for you. I thank you for sharing all of that. And I'm so grateful that I was here and able to hear these things from you, because it inspires me to pass it on to those who are coming after me. And it has been a pleasure. Thank you for sharing so much. And I look forward to how your stories impact the future generations of your own family. Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome, and thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much for taking the time to watch the African Diaspora Experience with us today. We hope that you enjoyed yourself and that you were inspired by all of the stories that you heard. We look forward to hosting you again. We hope that you tune into future episodes. Thank you.